Praise God. Shalom. And I'm happy to be here for the second in a series of 5 two-hour teachings. In the first session of 2 hours, I told you my personal testimony, how I was a person who hated Christians, loved the Muslims, hated the Christians. Today, I'm a person who loves the Christians, loves the Muslims, loves the Jews, the Hindus, the Buddhists, all human beings. And I was sharing in the first 2 hours about how our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is a God of love. He loves the Jews, he loves the Christians, he loves the Hindus, he loves the Buddhists, he loves the Muslims, he loves all human beings. He might not be happy with certain human beings about their pagan beliefs if they are not Judeo-Christians, but he loves all human beings because all human beings are created in the image of God. The first session was very, very much a personal testimony of how God has transformed me into a loving person and how our God is a God of love, our Bible is a Bible of love, and all our teachings are love. And if it's hatred, it cannot be our God. If it's hatred, it cannot be our Bible. And our Messiah, the Messiah of the Jews and the Christians, is a Messiah who is a Jew who speaks Hebrew and is a Messiah of love. What I want to do in this second teaching is to talk about the biblical roots, the biblical prophetic roots of the war with Islam, and to make very clear parallels between the New Testament and Old Testament, and of course the diametrically opposed teachings of the Quran and the Islamic faith, which, as I said before, is not really a religion, but is a satanic cult. And I also mentioned briefly that our God is a God who does not like the sword. The sword is a despicable symbol of death and destruction, and that all of us, human beings, are created in the image of God, and that's why God hates the sword, because the sword was designed to kill human beings, to destroy God's children. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to basically continue where I was in the first 2 hours and talk about the 2 most important commandments in the Bible. Jesus teaches the Jews. Jesus is a rabbi teaching the Jews in Mark 12, 28 to 31, that the 2 most important commandments in the whole Bible are Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, with all thy strength. That is the first commandment of all. And the second commandment is like, namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. These are the 2 main commandments. There are no commandments greater than these 2 commandments, to love God and love your fellow as yourself. I want to start first with the first deception of Islam. The first deception of Islam, as I teach it at least, the first deception of Islam is that Islam is a religion of love. And I know that Muslims are good people, just like Germans are good people, just like Russians are good people. But Nazis are not good people. They're not loving people. Russians are loving people, but communists are not. Muslims are loving people, but the Islamic system is not a loving system. Why? Because if Jesus says that the 2 most important commandments are to love God and to love your fellow as yourself, and these 2 commandments are not in the Quran, so what kind of a book is the Quran? How can a Muslim say that the Quran is a book of love when the 2 most important commandments of all are not there? Love the Lord thy God, love thy fellow as thyself, are not in the Quran. Now, Muslims are loving people because they are created in the image of God. Our God is a loving God. Allah is not a loving God. And our Messiah is a loving Messiah. And our Bible is a loving book. The Quran is not. I want to talk a little bit about why should we love our Father? Why should we love our fellow as ourselves? And this will lead us directly into this teaching of the next 2 hours. You know, I've been blessed by God. I have a wonderful wife, 35 years. I have children, I have grandchildren, and God has blessed me exceedingly. And my message has been evolving for many years, and it is still evolving. And in fact, I have 3 grandchildren, 2 from my older son and 1 granddaughter from my younger son. And I'm going to talk about them in a moment. But my message evolves because as a father, as a husband, as a grandfather, I begin to understand, I believe I begin to understand what God is trying to get across in the Bible. What makes parents happy? You know, parents get married, they have children, and then the fighting begins between the father and the mother as to whom do the children resemble? Who do they resemble? And I remember for many years I was debating with my wife, Rachel, do my two sons, Aaron and Jacob, resemble me, or do they resemble more their mom? And finally, Rachel beat me in the debate, and I finally conceded that from the waist down, my sons resemble me. From the waist up, they resemble their mom. So they got the mom's looks, and they got her brains, and they're wonderful sons, and I am blessed like crazy. But you see, being parents is really rather kind of an ego trip. And fathers and mothers are always looking at their children to see, do the children resemble more the father, or do they resemble more the mother? And I think God is in heaven laughing at all of this because we all resemble God. We are all created in God's image. And basically, it doesn't matter who the mother is and who the father is. We are all in God's image because the mother and father came from their mothers and fathers, and so on and so forth, all the way back to Adam and Eve. What makes parents happy? When you have children, you work hard morning, day, and night to feed your children, to clothe them, to give them all their needs. And you only want one thing from your kids if you're normal parents. You want your children to love you back. That's all you want. All parents want when they see their kids growing up is to see the beam of light in their eyes, the love that the children show to the parents when they are fed and when they are cleaned and when they are clothed and when parents play with their children. This is the greatest thing on earth, to have children and to be with your children and to love them and have them love you back. That's all God wants from us. We are all children of God. And all God wants from us is that we should love God. All parents want is that the children should love the parents. What makes parents upset? When the children don't love the parents. You know, sometimes parents are good to their children, maybe too good, and the kids come out spoiled rotten. And you want to know something? I think that's an adequate description, perhaps of Americans or Israelis or Europeans, whom God has blessed and blessed and blessed. And the more God blesses us, the more we turn our hearts against God. And indeed, in Deuteronomy 8, there is a teaching there which is extremely important. God says, I'm paraphrasing now, in Deuteronomy 8, the day will come when your houses will multiply, your flocks will multiply, your gold and silver will multiply, and everything you have will multiply. You'll become exceedingly rich, and your heart will wax heavy against the Lord. And you will say, I did this with my own hands. Or, as Bill Clinton used to say, it's the economy, stupid. And what God says in Deuteronomy 8, he continues, he says, no. He says, I, the Lord your God, am the one who gives you the ability to attain this wealth. So we should never become arrogant and cocky and say to God, God, you didn't have anything to do with this. We did this ourselves. And to Bill Clinton, when he says, hey, it's the economy, stupid, we have to say to him, no, stupid, it's not the economy. It is God who gives us the ability to attain this wealth. So like I said before, God has blessed us. Today we have running water, something we didn't have 100 years ago. We have electricity, we have cars, we have planes, we have computers, washing machines, dishwashers. People don't have to work nearly as hard as they used to have to work in the past to survive. Today, life is luxurious. Life is convenient. And people don't understand that all these blessings come from God. They come also from man's genius. But man's genius is from the inspiration that God gives us. So God wants us to love him. God blesses us. Parents bless their children. And like I said many times, the children come out rotten, and the kids do not appreciate what the parents do for them. All God wants is that we should recognize him and praise him and adore him and love him. Let's look at the next commandment that Jesus says is like, namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And I explained in the first 2 hours of teaching how I used to hate the Germans, how I used to hate the Russians, how I used to hate the Catholics, how I used to hate the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And praise God, I got the hatred out of me. You know, there's a saying or a teaching, but this is what I really believe, that when a person hates, it's like a person prepares a vial, like a test tube, of poison for the hated person to drink. But in the end, it is the hater who drinks the poison and dies. And I believe that when a person hates, the person dies. When a person loves, the person lives. And the message that I want to reiterate today in this second teaching is what I said in the first teaching. This is a teaching, I believe, it's my feeling from God, is that this is a teaching about love versus hate, good versus evil, God versus Satan, war versus peace, and creation versus destruction. And we're going to talk about this as it is prophesied in the Bible. Why should we love our neighbor as ourselves? Because our neighbor as ourselves, human beings, we are all created in the image of God. All of us, whether we are whites or blacks or Hispanics or Hindus or Buddhists or any other group in the world, we are all children of God. As a father and as a grandfather, I always like to come out with these parallels. What makes a father happy? What makes a grandfather happy? When you have children or when you have grandchildren and they play together and they grow up together and they love each other and they caress each other and they bless each other and then they go to school together. They get married, then they have children, and then you have the next generation. Then you have, for the Christians, the Christmas dinner or the Easter dinner, or for the Jewish people, a Hanukkah dinner or Passover Seder. Or if you're all our Americans, Jews and Christians, you have the Thanksgiving dinner, and the whole family is around the table. The mother, the father, the children, the grandparents, the great-grandparents. And, you know, many times I am in Christian homes, and I see this very famous picture of a banquet table set for the Messiah. The Messiah sits, of course, at the head of the table. And this table is a long table. It goes into infinity. And all people in heaven will be seated at this table with the Messiah. And many times I think to myself about, like I said, the Christmas dinner or the Easter dinner for Christians, or the Passover Seder, or the high holidays feasts, or the Passover and Pentecost and Sukkot feasts where we all sit around the table and enjoy together. The greatest happiness in life for me probably is like a church potluck lunch or dinner where all the people bring in dishes from their homes and everyone sits around the table and enjoys from everyone else's cooking, and the banter and the levity and the happiness that everyone shares together for an hour or two of lordly bliss. What makes parents and grandparents unhappy? And unfortunately, we see this in some families where brothers and sisters fight each other, hate each other, abuse each other, curse each other, hit each other, stab each other, shoot each other, kill each other. And the worst punishment for a human being is to bury his or her child. Most parents are ready to give their lives so that their children will stay alive. And unfortunately, we see parents burying children. And I don't want to get into the subject of abortion, which is not part of my message, but abortion is the killing of children. And not only are these fetuses, these little babies, murdered, but the parents who commit abortion are basically murdering themselves. And they suffer with this for the rest of their lives, that they kill their own little babies. So people who participate in abortion basically are murdering themselves as well as their little children. And God, of course, mourns when he sees these things. God is the ultimate creator, and any child who dies is mourned for by God. You know, I have this experience, beautiful experience in my life. I have two wonderful sons. My older son, Aaron, married a Yemenite, Algerian, Jewish girl, darker skin, beautiful woman. And my two little grandchildren from her are darker skinned. And to tell you the truth, they really do not look like me. But I look at the beam in their eyes, and when I call them over to give me a kiss and they start running away from me, and I have to chase them and catch them and squeeze them and tickle them and torture them, and I feel kind of like that's probably how God feels with us. The love for the children, the love for the grandchildren. And if my skin is a little lighter or their skin is a little darker, I can assure you, with my experience of my grandchildren, God is completely colorblind. My younger son, Jacob, married a Russian Jewish girl. We're all Jewish people, but we are from all over the earth. And we have black people, and we have Chinese people, and we have Caucasian people, and people from India. And, you know, America is called the melting pot. Israel is called the pressure cooker. because we have Jewish people who have come home from all over the world. And so my younger son marries a Russian Jewish girl, and she bears him my little granddaughter, Moriah, this last summer. And here I have a blonde, blue-eyed Scandinavian beauty. And on the other hand, I have two grandchildren who are a little darker. And it reminds me kind of like when you're in America and you go to Golden Corral or Luby's or Western Sizzlin', and you have all these buffet dishes and everybody chooses something they want to eat. And then at the end, we all go to the sinful part of the restaurant, which is the ice cream machine. And you have these little levers. And you bring down one lever, and it's chocolate ice cream, which I love very much. And you bring down the other lever, and it's vanilla ice cream, which I love very much. And there's only one thing that I love more than vanilla and chocolate, and that is swirl, which is in the middle. You pull the middle lever, and you get chocolate and vanilla. And so I've got two chocolate grandchildren and one vanilla grandchild. So I can assure you that I love them mixed up together, and I think God loves all of us mixed up together. And that's how I feel about children. That's how I feel about why my children should love each other and why they should love me. And like I said before, the worst thing for parents is to bury a child. The worst thing for our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is to see the death of his children. And I alluded to this in the first teaching, that our God finds the sword to be an abomination. The sword is an evil instrument of death, death of those created in the image of God. And I'd like to give you a quote. There are many quotes in the Bible, but I want to start with one of the earliest ones from Genesis chapter 9, from the generation of Noah. And this is verse 6. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. In other words, we are all created in the image of God, and already in chapter 9 of Genesis, God is saying that whoever sheds man's blood must have his blood shed. How is the blood shed? By the sword or by the knife. The sword is an abomination. It says many, many times in the Bible that anyone who builds a temple or an altar unto God must never use iron implements, because iron implements are implements of death. The sword is an implement of death, and this is hateful in the eyes of God. King David, whom we all love, Jews love King David, Christians love King David, Messiah comes out of the loins of King David, but King David himself was disqualified from building the temple in Jerusalem. It was Solomon, his son, who built it, because King David was a man of the sword. King David had slain many, many people. He was a man of the sword. He was a general. He was a soldier. If you remember, David killed Goliath. So God says, you are a great man, David, and you are the creator of the kingdom, or you took over after Saul, but you will not build a temple. Your son Solomon, he will build a temple, because Solomon made love, not war. Solomon was a man of love, not war. Solomon had his sins, but he was not a killer. He was more of a diplomat than David. And so God really does not like the sword. God hates the sword. And indeed, if we look at the Gospels, and if we look at the story about Peter drawing his sword and chopping off the ear of the Roman legionnaire, what does Jesus say to him? He says, Peter, put the sword away. He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. So even Jesus is preaching here against the sword. The sword is an instrument of evil because it kills human beings. We are all created in the image of God. Now, the first deception of Islam is that Islam is a religion of love. And I've shown you that the commandments, love the Lord thy God, love thy fellow as thyself, do not appear in the Quran or in the Hadith. Hadith is another form of Islamic teaching. Muslims are loving people because they're human beings created in the image of God. But the Islamic teachings are not teachings of love. It appears nowhere in the Quran. The second deception of Islam is that Islam is a religion of peace. And I will show you very quickly, Islam is not a religion of peace. Islam is a religion of constant warfare. And the sword, which we just mentioned, is the device to kill human beings, is the symbol of Islam. And the Muslims are proud of it. And the Muslims in Arabic even defined their religion as Din Asif. Din Asif means the religion of the sword. Islam is the religion of the sword. And we will talk about how Islam became a religion of the sword. But let's talk about Islam, the religion of peace. Why is Islam not a religion of peace? Why is this the second deception? And the answer is this. In English, you have the word peace. In English, you have another word, pacification. Pacification originates in the word peace. But pacification does not mean peace. And for those of us who remember the war in Vietnam, the media in the United States, the radio, the TV, the newspapers, spoke about this or that Viet Cong village being pacified. That usually meant immolated in napalm. That Viet Cong village no longer existed. Pacification is a euphemism for the destruction of the enemy, the conquest or forced suppression or conversion of the enemy. That's what Islam means. And in fact, Islam divides the world into two. You have the Dar es-Salam, the house of Islam, the house of peace, and you have the Dar al-Harb, the house of war, the house of the infidel. So who is of the Dar es-Salam? Who is of the house of Islam, the house of peace? The Muslims. And who is of the house of war, the house of the infidel? The infidel. Who is the infidel? The Jew, the Christian, the Hindu, the Buddhist, and yes, even some Muslims are of the house of the infidel. And we're going to talk extensively about how Islam refers to the Muslims who are infidels, the Muslims who are not true Muslims, and they are to be killed also. Let's talk about the utopia of Islam. Now, utopia in English means best place around. But in the original Greek, utopia in English comes from the Greek eutopia. Eu in Greek means no. Topia, like topography, means place. Eutopia, utopia, means no place. There is no place as a utopia. So let's look at the Islamic utopia. And let's take Afghanistan. There are a few instances that I'm going to be showing you now. Afghanistan was a country settled originally by Hindus and Buddhists. Later came the Jews and the Christians, and then finally came the Muslims. The first to be destroyed were the pagans. The Hindus and the Buddhists were the first to be wiped out. The Islamic religion teaches, first we destroy the pagans, and we respect the Jews and the Christians, so next to be destroyed, after the pagans, will be the Jews and the Christians. First we destroy the pagans, then we destroy the Jews and the Christians. But we will use the Jews and the Christians as our slaves to destroy the pagans, and once we have finished using the Jews and the Christians, then we will kill them. This is the expression dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I. Dhimmi means second-class subservient citizens of the country. Jews and Christians are dhimmis. We are servants and slaves of Allah and of the Islamic system. So first to go were the pagans, the Hindus, the Buddhists, then the Jews and the Christians. And once the pagans were gone and the Jews and the Christians were gone, and then only the Muslims were left in Afghanistan, what do the Muslims do to each other when everyone else is dead? They kill each other. Now, Afghanistan is divided into four different ethnic groups. You've got the Pashtuns, who are related to the Pakistanis across the border. You've got the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, and they are related, they are the Northern Alliance that we heard of. They are related to their former brethren in the former Soviet Union. And then you have the Hazaras, who are Shiite, Iranian-type Muslims, who are hated because they are Shiites. So these four groups slaughter each other, and they have been doing so for hundreds of years. Afghanistan basically self-destructs. It is turned into a black hole vortex of self-destruction, and that is the utopia of Islam. And then once they have finished destroying the country and running it into the ground, who has to be called in to pick up the pieces? The United States of America. And so the United States of America and the UN go into Afghanistan to liberate the people of Afghanistan from the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda. And they are being fought by the fanatic Muslims who are trying to destroy the Westerners whose purpose it is to bring peace and prosperity and progress to Afghanistan. Let's look at another example of the Islamic utopia. Algeria. Algeria is a country where there are no Jews or Christians. There are no Hindus or Buddhists. And there are only Muslims. And by the way, these Muslims in Algeria, they are all Sunni Muslims. There are no Shiites. So you don't have the internal fighting between the Sunnis and the Shiites. There are only Sunnis. Now, about a decade ago, there was an election in Algeria, and the radical fanatic Muslim party won, and the military generals running Algeria canceled the elections. This started a civil war. And what has happened in the last decade or so is that over 170,000 Algerian Muslims have been slaughtered by fellow Algerian Muslims. This is not the Jews, it's not the Christians, it's not Israel, it's not the United States, it's Muslims fighting Muslims. And I want to tell you a very terrible testimony that I received from my wife, Rachel. I spoke a little bit about my wife, Rachel. She was from Egypt. She was born like I was born in 1949. I was born in New York. She was born in Cairo, Egypt. Rachel spent the first 20 years of her life in Egypt. Arabic is her mother tongue. And in Israel today, Rachel has been working already 20 years as a radio monitor. She monitors the radio broadcasts of our Arabic language neighbors' broadcasts. And you've all heard of Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera satellite network is the Arabic equivalent, more or less, of CNN. And my wife has to listen and watch Al Jazeera every day. My wife has to sit there 7.5 hours every day listening to the poison that is coming out from the Islamic broadcasts about how they're going to kill the Jews and kill the Christians and even kill each other. And the Al Jazeera brings an interview with an Algerian fundamentalist Muslim terrorist who was apprehended by the Algerian government. And he was interviewed by the Al Jazeera correspondent. And the man, in very, very cold, calculating terms, unemotional, explains how the infidels are dealt with. And I'm not talking about Jews or Christians. I'm talking about what Muslims do to fellow Muslims. A certain village in Algeria is determined to be a collaborationist village, a village collaborating with the secular Muslim government in Algiers. It's considered a traitorous, infidel, heretic village. And so the terrorists go up on top of the mountains around the village, and they watch the village very carefully for a number of days. And then when they have the daily routine figured out, they wait in the morning for the men to go to work. By 5, 6 in the morning, the Algerian men go to work. Then these terrorists descend on the village, and they block off the village. Nobody can go in, nobody can go out. And they go over to the women and say, listen, cook us a festive meal. And the women understand with whom they're dealing. They cook a festive meal. Then after the men have their festive meal, and they have their bellies full, they pop some pills to get on a high, hallucinogenic pills. By the way, there is a word which is very well known in English. It is a contribution from the Arabic language to the English language. The word is assassin. Assassin comes from the Arabic word hashashin. Hashashin comes from the word hashish, or pot, or marijuana. And the assassins were people, the hashashin were people who smoked this type of cannabis, this type of marijuana, and then they'd get on a high and they'd become the biggest murderers in the Middle East. And the Crusaders, when they were in the Middle East 1,000 years ago, trembled at the thought of going into war against these Islamic hashashin, because these Islamic hashashin, or assassins, were the most ferocious fighters that you could imagine after they took these hallucinogenic pills. So these hallucinogenic pills are taken, men got on a high after they've had their meal that the women prepared for them. They then are on a high, they rape the women. After they rape the women, they slit their throats of the women. Then they slit the throats of the children and the old people. Everyone in the village gets his throat slit. Then it's not over, by the way. Then they come out with electrical chainsaws and they chop off the arms and the legs, so that when the men come home from work, the men will understand what happens, as it says in the Quran. Chapter 5, verse 33 of the Quran says, Those who make war on Allah and his Prophet Muhammad and spread disorder in the land, we will kill, we will crucify, we will chop their arms and legs off, and we will banish from the earth. And this is, dear brothers and sisters, this is what Islam does to their fellow Muslims. This is not only a question of chopping off the head of Daniel Pearl or Nick Berg. This is what they do to each other. So why should we expect anything less? The purpose of this teaching is to show you how the murderous barbarism of Islam comes directly from their Quran and from their Hadith, to understand the difference between the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the God of Ishmael, the God of Allah, the moon god, the war god, and the sword god. Another example of the Islamic utopia is Iraq. I think by far Iraq is the most spectacular example of the Islamic utopia. The Dar es Salaam, the House of Peace, in which over 2 million Muslims, Iranians, Iraqis, Shiites, Sunnis, Kurds, Kuwaitis, Palestinians, and others were killed by Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is responsible for the deaths of over 2 million fellow Muslims. Saddam Hussein wanted to kill the Jews and the Christians, but in the end, he killed his own fellow Muslims. And indeed, some people say that the Muslims can only understand a leader like Saddam Hussein because the Muslims need a strong leader. All I can say is that the fruit of Islam, the terrorism, the barbarism, springs forth from the Quran and the Hadith. And the teachings that we don't find in the Bible, horrible teachings we find in the Quran, and the blessings that we find in the Bible, love the Lord thy God, love thy fellow as thyself, we don't find them in the Quran. The Quran is diametrically opposed to the Bible. Islam is diametrically opposed to Judeo-Christianity, and Allah, Satan, is diametrically opposed to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Muslim teaching, like I said before, is that there cannot be peace on earth until all non-Muslims are either converted to Islam or butchered. There is a joke, and it's not really a very funny joke, but it is a very instructive joke, is about what is the difference between neurotic people and psychotic people. Neurotic people dream about castles in the air. Psychotic people live in castles in the air. And psychiatrists collect the rent. Neurotic people dream about castles in the air. That kind of applies to every human being. All human beings have dreams. But to live in castles in the air means you are psychotic. Let's look at Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler was psychotic in many ways, but for the purposes of this teaching, I will give 2 psychoses of Adolf Hitler. Psychosis number 1 was that Adolf Hitler believed he could conquer the earth. The second psychosis of Adolf Hitler, he believed he could kill all the Jews on the face of the earth. Now, firstly, why is conquering the earth a psychosis? Because no human being can conquer the earth. The second psychosis about killing the Jews, that the Jews, as it is described in God's word, will never be destroyed. There will always be Jews on the face of the earth. Jeremiah 31, verse 125 says, there will be no more Jews on the face of the earth when the moon, the sun, and the stars stop shining. You know what that means? That means you better pray for the Jews. Because when the Jews go, the world goes. Now, conquering the earth, Alexander the Great tried it. The Romans tried it. Hitler tried it. Stalin tried it. Napoleon tried it. Only the Lord in heaven has dominion over the earth. No human being can conquer the earth. And for those people who don't believe in God and don't believe in the Bible, the Jews are scattered all over the earth. If you can't conquer the earth, you cannot reach and kill all the Jews. So these are the 2 psychoses of Adolf Hitler, that he thought he could conquer the earth and kill the Jews. What does Islam believe? Islam believes that the Dar es Salaam conquers the Dar al-Harb, meaning that the whole world must be Islamic. They really believe this. What does that mean? They're going to conquer the earth, psychosis number 1. They're going to kill all the Jews, psychosis number 2. They're going to kill all the Christians, psychosis number 3. They're going to kill all the Buddhists, psychosis number 4. They're going to kill all the Hindus, psychosis number 5. And then, when everybody else is dead, they will kill each other, as I mentioned in Algeria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and the list goes on. And we're going to talk about the spirit of Ishmael and why Muslims kill each other. So, forgive me for those of you who may be offended by what I'm going to say. But if Islam plans to kill 5 billion human beings so that 1 billion Muslims will remain alone on the earth, I think that's a psychosis too. How can 1 billion people destroy 5 billion people, destroy America, destroy China, and get away with it? Or destroy India, which is a nuclear power, and get away with it. And like I said before, when they finish killing everyone else, they go ahead and kill each other because their God is Satan. And Satan hates human beings because we are created in the image of God, and Satan hates God. So Islam, forgive me for saying this, is not a religion. Islam, at best, is a satanic cult, and at worst, Islam is a psychosis. Islam is a sickness. It is a mental illness. It is a state of mind of murder, of the sword. What I want to do now, I want to go into the third deception of Islam and start working with the Bible a little more closely, and to show you how Islam was prophetically described already in the Bible. The Muslims say that Allah is just another name for God. So let's look at God and let's look at Allah. Let's see if it's the same or not. Firstly, this teaching is designed primarily for Jews and Christians. I think, of course, that Hindus and Buddhists and even Muslims can watch this teaching, maybe not necessarily agree with everything I'm saying, but if you don't want to agree, write to me about it and I'll show you why you're wrong. Our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is called the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because of his choice of genealogy. He chose Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He did not choose Ishmael, and he did not choose Esau. And I want to go, indeed, to chapter 16. And we already did this about the sword. I was showing about how God does not like the sword. God does not like the killing of human beings. That's not the right chalk. I'll use this one. This we did already. Genesis 9:16 about shedding blood. Anyone who sheds blood will have his blood shed. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about this verse here. Chapter 16 of Genesis, verses 11 and 12. Ishmael, the wild donkey, the wild ass of a man. Now, as you all remember, Abraham and Sarah were having problems having children, and so Abraham took as a second wife the handmaiden servant of his wife Sarah, and Sarah became very, very angry with Hagar, the maidservant, because she became very haughty, she became very arrogant, and so she was banished from the tribe. Hagar was banished from the tribe, and the angel of the Lord appears before Hagar in verse 11. And the angel of the Lord said unto Hagar, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. Ishmael in Hebrew means the Lord hath heard, has listened to you. Verse 12. And he will be a wild man. In Hebrew, the word is pere Adam. Pere is like Spanish burro. He will be a wild donkey. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand will be against his hand. And he shall dwell, it says here in the Bible, in the English, in the King James, in the presence, but that's not what it means in Hebrew. He will dwell in the face of all his brethren. Now, in American slang, there's an expression which says, hey man, you're in my face. You better get out of my face, or that means war. And that's exactly where it came from. It came from chapter 16 of Genesis, verse 12. Ishmael, his hand will be against all his brethren's hands, and all his brethren's hands will be against his hand, and he will dwell in the face of his brethren. Ishmael is a wild donkey. Can you visualize a wild donkey kicking in all directions? You cannot get near a wild donkey when it is kicking in all directions. This is the spirit of Ishmael. And I want to ask you a question. Does Abraham love his son Ishmael? Of course he loves his son Ishmael. Does it matter to Abraham that Ishmael is a wild donkey? No. On the contrary, what does Jesus say about the 99 sheep? What does Jesus say about the lost sheep? Jesus goes after the lost sheep because the 99 sheep know what they're all about, and the 100th sheep, the wild one, like Ishmael, needs more attention because he's lost. And Ishmael was a wild sheep. He was wild, and Abraham loved him. When Abraham was 99, by the way, I have to emphasize this one more time. Ishmael, being a wild donkey, has a certain spirit. His hand will be against all his brethren's hands, and all his brethren's hands will be against his hand, and he will dwell in the face of his brethren, meaning constant warfare. And what I explained to you before about Afghanistan, Ishmael is the forefather of these people. Algeria, Ishmael is the forefather of these people. Saddam Hussein, the Shiites, the Sunnis, Ishmael is the forefather of these people, where they are killing each other. Muslims killing Muslims. And the Muslims fight the Christians. And the Muslims fight the Jews. And the Muslims fight the Hindus. And the Muslims fight the Buddhists. And the Muslims fight each other. Again, this chapter 16, verses 11 and 12, are amongst the most prophetic verses in the Bible, especially in light of 9/11. If Americans can't understand 9/11, it's because they don't understand this verse in chapter 16, verse 11 and 12. What I want to do now is I want to go back to Abraham, chapter 17, verses 18 to 21. I'm going to mark this off here as we go. Chapter 17 in Genesis, verses 18 to 21. Abraham said unto God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." In other words, God says to Abraham, you're going to have another son. Abraham's 99, Sarah is 90. Who could believe that Abraham would have another son at age 99? And his wife was beyond conception years. She was 90. And basically, Abraham says to God, you know what, thanks a lot, but no thanks. I've got Ishmael, and it's enough for me that Ishmael should live before thee. This is verse 18, okay? And God said, Sarah, thy wife, shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with Isaac for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. So the question the Jews and Christians need to ask is, with whom is the covenant? Is the covenant with Isaac, or is it with the covenant with Ishmael? Muslims say the covenant is with Ishmael. But God says here in the Bible that the covenant is with Isaac. How many times does he say it? 5 times. Is God a confused God? Is God a lying God? Is God a crazy God? No, God is absolutely clear, and he's absolutely faithful to his covenants. Amen? And as for Ishmael, verse 20 of chapter 17, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make Ishmael fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. Did God lie, or did God keep his word? God did make Ishmael the father of many nations. But here comes the punchline in verse 21. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. So, the covenant is with whom? With Isaac or with Ishmael? The covenant is with Isaac. This is the first time God says this, and we are going to look at the second time now. Okay? And remember Ishmael mocking. We're going to get to that now. That's in verse 12, chapter 21, verse 9 and verse 12. Let's go to Genesis, as I said, chapter 21. And we have the verses there, 9 and 12, 21, 9. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Now, what happens here? What's this story about? Abraham has his son Ishmael. When Ishmael is 13, when he has his bar mitzvah, he's becoming a man. And that's when Isaac is born. And Isaac is around 2 or 3 or 4 when he gets weaned, when he stops suckling from his mother's breast, from Sarah's breast. And they have a party. And now Isaac is becoming a young boy. He's no longer a baby. Ishmael here must be about 16 or so. And we see something, forgive me for drawing a gross comparison. I don't know how long this video, DVD, CD, audio, MP3 will be shown. I don't know how long it'll last. But we are now in the midst, in May of the year 2004, we are in the midst of a very big scandal regarding the Abu Ghraib prisoner facility in Iraq, and about certain sexual harassment abuses carried out by the US military on the Iraqi soldiers there. And I want to show you the biblical parallel here. Again, chapter 21, verse 9, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Now, mocking, certain Bibles say behaving in a haughty manner, and either mocking or behaving in a haughty manner is very, very puritanical. It's very, very strict. It's very asexual. That's how the King James Bible is. But let me tell you, in Hebrew, the word that appears in the Hebrew Bible for mocking is litzachek. Litzachek, in Hebrew, and I know you've learned with Joseph Good and you've studied with Sam Peake. Here you have litzachek. Litzachek is the word that appears. Now, what does litzachek mean? Litzachek means sexual foreplay, sexual abuse, sexual perversion. Now, in the Middle East, there is I don't want to say a tradition, but there is an ethnic behavior in the Middle East, mostly among the Arabs, and those who are influenced by the Arabs and the Muslims, that to show dominance, one male over another male, means homosexual misbehavior and perversion. What happened here basically was Ishmael unzipped his pants and did something very naughty to his little brother. And Sarah saw this. And when Sarah saw this, wherefore Sarah said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son Ishmael, for the son of this bondwoman Hagar shall not be heir with thy son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son Ishmael. Abraham loved Ishmael, even though he was wild and perverse. And God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad Ishmael, and because of thy bondwoman Hagar. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. In other words, Ishmael also becomes a nation, and Isaac becomes a nation. So here, when it says Ishmael should live before you, God says to Abraham, Ishmael will live before me, but your seed will be through Isaac. So this is the first time God mentions Isaac as being the seed of Abraham. So that's the first time. Then here we have the mocking, the sexual perversion, and Sarah casts out Ishmael and Hagar. This is the second time God says, your seed will be through Isaac, not through Ishmael. Okay, what do the Muslims say? The Muslims say Ishmael. Is God a confused God? God is not a confused God. God says in the Bible, Isaac, it's Isaac. But the Muslims say Ishmael. And we're going to talk about Islam. The third time God mentions Isaac is in chapter 22 of Genesis, Mount Moriah. The whole chapter describes how God says to Abraham, take your one and only begotten son, Isaac, and sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. What do the Muslims say? No, Ishmael. And the Muslims have a religion called Eid al-Adha. Eid al-Adha is the holiday, the festival of the sacrifice of Ishmael. Now, nowhere in the Bible does it say that it was Ishmael, but it was Isaac. So the Islamic Quran, the Islamic religion, is in direct violation of what God is saying in the Bible. And not only that, we all know from the Bible that Isaac was to be sacrificed on Mount Moriah. The Muslims say that Ishmael was supposed to be sacrificed. Does anyone know where? Not on Mount Moriah, not in Jerusalem, but in Mecca, at the Kaaba, at the Black Stone. The Islamic religion teaches that Abraham built the Kaaba, the Black Stone, that house of pagan worship, and that Abraham was going to sacrifice Ishmael in Mecca. And I think it's extremely critical for all the viewers and listeners of this program to understand that Jerusalem is never mentioned even once in the Quran, and Mecca is never mentioned even once in the Bible. We are talking here, brothers and sisters, about polarities. We're talking about opposites. In other words, if God says it's Isaac, Islam says it's Ishmael. If our God says love, their God says hate. If our God says peace, their God says war. If our God says the sword is an abomination, Islam takes the sword and makes it their symbol. I don't know if you've seen the flag of Mecca, the flag of Saudi Arabia, but there's a green banner with Arabic letters, and the banner says, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And underneath it, like an underlining, is the sword of Islam. And like I said before, the Muslims call their religion the religion of the sword, Deen as-Sif. So here we have the third example of where God says, take your one and only begotten son, Isaac, and sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. And Islam says, no, it's not Isaac, it is Ishmael. Chapter 25 of Genesis, we have the fourth instance, where God says, it is through your son, Isaac. After the incident on Mount Moriah, it seems that Sarah was heartbroken because she heard that her husband was taking her son to sacrifice him. And the Jewish tradition teaches that she died as a result of this terrible story that she heard, that her husband probably went nuts and he was going to sacrifice his son Isaac, so she died. Chapter 25, then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And Keturah bore him Zimran, Yokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shu'ah. And then it gives the lineage of Yokshan and all the others. And Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac. But unto the sons of the concubines, which Abraham had, you know, it's interesting, there was no Viagra in those days. He was 147 years old, and he had Keturah, and he had concubines. Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son while he yet lived eastward into the east country. So here we have the fourth time that Isaac is mentioned. Isaac is mentioned once, twice, thrice, 4 times, and then in chapter 25, verse 6 and 9, the Bible seals it. It says, these are the generations of Isaac, and Abraham begot Isaac. That's chapter 25. Okay, so we're looking at 25, 6 and 9. Okay, and then we have chapter 27, 25, 6 and 9. I must have skipped something there. 6 and 9. And his sons, Isaac, okay. So, 5 times it's mentioned, and Abraham begot Isaac, Keturah, Mount Moriah, Ishmael being sent away, and then, of course, the first time when Sarah is pregnant. Okay? So God now is the God of Abraham and Isaac, not Abraham and Ishmael. But the Muslims say Abraham and Ishmael. Let's look at the next generation. We have Esau and we have Jacob. Now, when you look at the Bible, it says that Isaac preferred his older son Esau. Rebekah, the wife, preferred Jacob. So here you had parental preferences. The father, Isaac, preferred Esau. The mother preferred Jacob. And Jacob realized that Esau was a wild person also, like his uncle, and basically bought the birthright from Esau for a bowl of lentils, and then took the blessing away from his brother. And his brother was extremely distraught that he took the blessing. And in chapter 27, verse 40, we see something very interesting here. And Esau comes to his father Isaac, who loves him more, and says, you know, Jacob took the blessing. You've got to bless me, Dad. You've got to bless me. Surely there must be something you can bless me with. And Isaac says to Esau, and by thy sword shalt thou live, and shalt serve thy brother. And it shall come to pass, when thou shalt have the dominion, that thou shalt break his yoke from off thy neck. And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand, then I will slay my brother Jacob. Slaying his brother, because Esau was a man of the sword. And the father blessed him, cursed him, and said, Al-harbecha techyeh, you will live by the sword. Chapter 28, verse 9, we see something very, very interesting. Esau was a sinner. Esau married pagan Canaanite women, very, very much to the anger of his parents, Rebekah and Isaac. When Jacob went off to Paran and married his uncle's daughters, Rachel and Leah, in order to patch up with his parents, Esau went and married the daughters of his uncle Ishmael. In other words, Jacob married two daughters of his uncle Laban, and Esau marries the two daughters of his uncle Ishmael, Mahalat and Bosmat, the daughters of Ishmael. Esau marries them, he marries his first cousins, and then he goes off to live with his uncle Ishmael. Birds of a feather flock together. In other words, we have a dichotomy within the same family, within the same flesh and blood. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are farmers, who are shepherds, they are men of love, they are men of peace. And then you have the men of the sword, Esau, who will live by the sword, and his uncle Ishmael, who lived in the face of his brethren. And we see in chapter 25, verse 18, Ishmael dies in the face of his brethren. He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. What did Jesus say to Peter when he cut off the ear of the legionnaire? He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. Does Jesus love the sword? No. Does the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob love the sword? No. Does Allah love the sword? Yes. Does Islam love the sword? Yes. Let's talk about Allah. By the way, before we talk about Allah, as I said before, I love to read the New Testament because the New Testament reconfirms and focuses on what the Old Testament is saying. You remember we said in the first teachings about love that Jesus says, love the Lord thy God, love thy fellows thyself. That's in Mark 12. But it also is in Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19:18. So the New Testament helps to focus out of 613 commandments on the two most important ones. Now we see something very, very important. If you go to the first gospel of Matthew, I just put Matthew 1. First gospel, first chapter, first page, first words of the New Testament. And it says, these are the generations of Jesus Christ. And it has the whole genealogy, the whole lineage. And what do you see smack in the middle of the 14 generations and the 14 generations? You see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You do not see Ishmael. And one of the things I want to say here, and I say some very tough things, as you know. For me, anyone, Jew or Christian, who supports Islam is a heretic and an infidel. Why? Because Islam delegitimizes the lineage, the genealogy, the holiness of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jews, of course, sin once if they do this. Christians who support Islam sin twice. Because not only are you denigrating and violating the holiness of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Old Testament, you are delegitimizing Jesus of Nazareth, through whose genealogy is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Any Jew, any Christian who supports Islam is delegitimizing the God of the Jew and the Christian, and is a heretic and an infidel. Let's look at Allah, and this will make it even starker, even sharper into focus. To understand Allah, you have to understand the life of Muhammad. Who is Muhammad? In which circumstances did Muhammad live? Muhammad lived in what is today Saudi Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula of then, and there were two major cities there at that time. One of them was Mecca, the other was Medina. And Muhammad was a camel caravan driver. Now, at some stage, he gained the attention of Khadija. Khadija was a widow. She was 12 years older than Muhammad, and she was attracted to him, and because she was a widow, she was free to marry him. She offered herself to him, and he accepted. And by marrying her, he became the owner of this camel caravan company. Now, these camel caravan companies in those days were like truckers today, and they were trucking around things around the Arabian Peninsula, from the Byzantine Empire, from the Holy Land to Saudi Arabia of today, to Yemen, to Africa, to Ubar, which is basically Oman today. Unlike truckers today, today if you're a trucker, you can either sleep in your cabin, in your truck at some truck stop, or you can go to a nice hotel, Motel 6, Hotel 8. You've got restaurants, you've got all the facilities basically to go to sleep wherever you want at any time. And either you are a trucker who drives by yourself, or you have a partner driving with you. But in the good old days of the camel caravans, there were no Motel 6s or Super 8s or Courtyard by Marriott. And what people did in those days was the Jews and the Christians who were carrying their merchandise, their goods on these camel caravans, would go along with these Arabian pagans who ran the camel caravans. And about an hour before sunset, they would stop, set up a camp, light a fire, and have their dinner or their Turkish coffee by the fireside. And they would basically sit and talk until bedtime came. And what would these people talk about? They would talk about their religions. The Jews would talk about Judaism, the Christians would talk about Christ, and the pagans would talk about their 360 pagan gods. Now, the system in Mecca and Medina around 622 AD was a pagan system with 360 pagan gods. They prayed to the moon, the sun, the stars, the mountains, the rivers, the deserts, the grass, the trees. They had all kinds of pagan gods, one for every day of the year. The three greatest gods of the 360 were the moon, the sun, and the stars. The moon was the father, the sun was the mother, and the moon and the sun, through their conjugal relationship, bore the three brightest stars in the firmament. And these three brightest stars are mentioned in the Quran by name. Muhammad was very, very much influenced by the Jews and the Christians. Muhammad admired the Jews and the Christians. He loved them. He was very influenced by them. He loved to talk to them. Now, Muhammad also had a problem. Muhammad was not crazy, but Muhammad had something similar to epilepsy. And by the way, everything I'm saying is not denied by the Muslims. Muhammad had a disease which caused him to fall, a neurological disorder. He would froth at the mouth. He would shudder. He would sweat. He would have a fever. He would have a choking sensation that he couldn't breathe. And it was during these choking sensations that Muhammad would hear voices. Now, how do you say a voice in Greek? A voice in Greek is D-E-M-O-N. Now, here in America, you say he's got the demons. But in Greek, the word is daemon. Now, the word daemon is not a bad word. Socrates heard a voice. Abraham, our forefather, heard a voice. Adam heard a voice. Noah heard a voice. Isaac and Jacob heard voices. Joseph heard voices. Moses heard voices. David and Solomon heard voices. And of course, Jesus heard voices. The question is, what is the voice saying? And the simple fact is that no one in the Judeo-Christian Bible suffered from epilepsy and heard voices as a result of neurological disorders. The voices that our prophets and apostles heard were voices of God. What Muhammad was listening to was demons as a result of his epileptic seizures. And Muhammad never performed any miracles. Muhammad just heard voices, and he would come to his people, said, well, today the angel Gabriel said this and that and the other thing. And the next day he would change and say, well, Gabriel just changed his mind, and now he's saying something else. So it was very, very mixed up with the things that Muhammad was hearing. And basically, the Quran is a collection of some very, very mixed up verses, which sometimes bless the Jews and the Christians, and sometimes curses the Jews and the Christians. And anyway, Muhammad, hearing these voices, goes to his wife Khadija, and he says to Khadija, tell me, dear, I'm hearing voices. Am I crazy, or am I a prophet? So I want to ask you a question. If a man loves his wife, and she loves him, and he hears voices, and he goes to his wife and says to his wife, am I crazy, or do I hear voices? Do you think that Khadija is going to say to her husband, Muhammad, you're crazy, you're nuts? She's going to say, no, mon chéri, you are, of course, the greatest and the latest of all the prophets. And so, because Khadija said to her husband that he's a prophet, he came to the Jews and Christians with whom he was working in his camel caravan trade routes, and he said to the Jews and the Christians, I'm a prophet. I'm greater than Moses, he said to the Jews. I'm greater than Jesus Christ, he said to the Christians. Now, if you're a Jew, you know that Moses is hot stuff for the Jews. Moses, for 40 years, was an Egyptian prince. He almost became Pharaoh. For 40 years, Moses was a shepherd unto Jethro. Now, one thing I forgot to mention a few moments ago, which I think bears mentioning now, that Isaac, the son of Abraham, was a farmer. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, was a shepherd. And when you are a farmer or a shepherd, you are part of God's creation plan. Ishmael and Esau were men of the sword. When you are a man of the sword, you are part of God's destruction plan. So here we have, again, the polarities. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are men of peace, men of love, shepherds, farmers, men of creation. Esau and Ishmael are men of war, men of the sword, men of destruction. So you have here not a sibling rivalry. What you have here is a spiritual decision within the same family. Are we going to be men of peace, or are we going to be men of war? Are we going to be men of love, or are we going to be men of hate? Are we going to be men of creation, or are we going to be men of destruction? So as I was saying before, Jesus, the greatest prophet of the Jewish people, is a shepherd for 40 years under Jethro. So Moses is a shepherd. Jesus of the Christians is called the Good Shepherd because he is a shepherd of men and women. So being a shepherd is a very blessed thing. So Moses is Prince of Egypt 40 years. He is shepherd 40 years. And at age 80, God gives him 40 more years of life till 120 to lead the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, lead them across the Red Sea. You have the 10 plagues, you have miracles. You have the destruction of the Egyptian charioteers, another miracle. You have the miracle of the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. You have all the miracles that took place in the Sinai desert. And of course, 40 years wandering in the Sinai desert or in the Arabian desert until they entered the Holy Land. And with this, I wanted to tell a little joke that I sometimes tell when I have the time to tell jokes. And that is that, of course, you probably know that God really never intended the Jewish people to go to Israel. He really wanted us to go to Canada. But what happened was that Moses was a stutterer. And when the children of Israel were in the desert in Sinai saying, oh, Moses, our leader, where are we going? He was trying to say Canada. But he was a stutterer. So he was saying, Canaan. So we went to Canaan. So that's Israel. Anyway. I don't know, this is a good joke to tell for Canadians also. How did Canada get its name? God calls over all of the Canadian people and the Prime Minister of Canada. He says, here's a box with letters. And it's kind of like the roundup with primetime when one of the guests sticks his hand in the basket and pulls out a name and somebody gets a $25 gift certificate for the bookstore. So anyway, so God calls over all the Canadians and the Prime Minister of Canada and says to the Prime Minister, I'm going to bless you today with the name of Canada. And what we're going to do is you're going to stick your hand in the box and you're going to pull out 3 letters. And the 3 letters will be the name of Canada. So the first letter, he sticks his hand in the box, C. A, N, A, and D. A, that's how Canada got its name. C and D with the A. So if you know Canadians and you know how the Canadians talk with the everything A, so you know that's very funny when I say that in Canada. So the children of Israel are crossing the desert 40 years, enter the Holy Land. Moses dies on Mount Nebo. Moses gives 120 years of his life to God's service. I pray God will bless me with 120 years to serve him too. Performs miracles. Muhammad never performed any miracles. And Moses gives the law. Islam is not under the law as the Jews and the Christians are. And so the Jews basically say to Muhammad, thank you, but no thanks. We don't think that you, a 46-year-old barefoot, illiterate nomad camel driver, we don't think you can be better than Moses. So he goes to the Christians, and he says, I'm greater than Jesus Christ. And as you saw in the first teaching, I speak about a number of miracles that Jesus performs. Muhammad never performed any miracles. And in fact, Muhammad was a murderer. Muhammad was a liar. Muhammad was a thief. Muhammad coveted his neighbor's property. God says, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods. And Muhammad brings in another God, Allah. We're going to talk about Allah in a moment. And so basically, Muhammad breaks every rule in the book. We read in Leviticus 2 weeks ago about how anyone who marries or goes to bed with his daughter-in-law, both the daughter-in-law and the offending father-in-law will be stoned to death. Muhammad takes the daughter of his son, Ziyad, her name is Zainab, forces Ziyad to divorce her so that Muhammad can have her. So this is a number of death sentences on Muhammad's head, and that is the great prophet of Islam. So he comes to the Christians and said, I am greater than Jesus Christ. And so the Christians said to him, thanks, but no thanks. And so now Muhammad is angry. He has been rejected by those he loved. He loved the Jews and the Christians. The Jews and the Christians rejected him. Therefore now Muhammad is very angry with the Jews and the Christians. Who are the Jews and the Christians? The Jews and the Christians are the people of the book. We are the Ahl al-Kitab. In Arabic, the people of the book. And so Muhammad comes out with an idea. He says, you know, the Jews and the Christians are right. They are monotheists. We in Arabia are foolish. We have 360 pagan gods. And what we need to do is abolish 359 pagan gods, and we will take the greatest of the Arabian pagan gods, Allah al-Ilahi, the moon god, the war god, and the sword god. And we will take this god, the moon god, the war god, the sword god. We will take Ishmael, who will be the forefather of our religion, who is, of course, greater than Isaac. And we will take the Allah al-Ilahi, the moon god, the war god, the sword god, who will be greater than the sissy-missy peace god and love god of the Jews and the Christians. Our God is a macho god, and their God is a sissy weakling god. And our God is greater than their God. And when the Muslims pray, forgive me for doing this in a holy teaching class in a church or synagogue, but I have to do this to get the point across. When the Muslims pray in the mosque and their battle cry is, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Now, CNN translates that as God is great. Allahu Akbar, Allah is God, Akbar is great. Now, if CNN translates it like that, then we know it's wrong. We know that God is great, but if CNN says it, there's a catch. Allahu Akbar does not mean God is great. Allahu Akbar means Allah is greater. Allah is greater. The word for great in Arabic is kabir. Akbar is diminutive. Akbar means greater. Allahu Akbar, Allah is greater. Allah, the moon god, the war god, the sword god, is greater than the sissy god of the Jews and the Christians. Because who is the God of the Jews and the Christians? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the farmer God, the shepherd God, the love God. I mean, this is like the hippie movement in the 1960s, the flower children. Our God is the sword God. That's what the Muslims are saying. Our God is greater than the God of the Jews and the Christians. Now, who is the God of the Jews and the Christians? God with a capital G. Our God is God. The God of Islam, if he says that he's greater than our God, who said he was greater than God before his fall, brothers and sisters? Satan, Lucifer. Satan said he was greater than God, and that's why God sent him to the pits of hell for 1,000 years. So what do we learn from all of this? That Allah is not God. Allah is Satan. Allah is the moon god, the war god, the sword god, and his bottom line is to kill human beings, because human beings are created in the image of God. And Satan will not rest until he uses human beings to kill other human beings. You know, I have to go back for a moment to the Germans. I used to believe, as a young person, a young Jewish man in America, in my teenage years, I used to be angry with President Truman, and I said, why did he drop the atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? The atomic weapons should not have been dropped on the Japanese at all. They should have been dropped on the Germans. Germany should have been erased. That's what many Jews felt. I hated the Germans, and I wanted to see them all destroyed, just as the Nazis wanted to see all the Jews destroyed. You know, today we look at Germany. Germany was a country that was deceived by Adolf Hitler. I said before, Germany in World War I was a good country. True Allied propaganda spoke badly about the barbaric Germans. But the Germans in World War I were civilized, and they waged war like any country would normally wage war. And the Germans were good to the Jews. And in World War II, the Germans were deceived, and they were led astray by Adolf Hitler. And I would never have said this as a young man, but I say it today. And I say that I mourn today for the 20 million Germans who died in World War II. Because many of these Germans were innocent, and those who were guilty because they were deceived by Satan. Adolf Hitler was a Satan. You see, Satan deceives, and then he destroys those who follow him. Allah is a deceiver God, and Allah will fight the Jews and the Christians to the last drop of Muslim blood until all the Muslims are dead. This is what Satan wants to do. Satan wants to kill all the Jews. Satan wants to kill all the Christians. Satan wants to kill all the Hindus. Satan wants to kill all the Buddhists. And Satan wants to kill all the Muslims. So Satan, through deception, divides and conquers mankind. And Satan is the devil. And like I said earlier, if you look at the book of Revelation, basically John on the island of Patmos is writing about Rome being the great harlot or being the great satanic system. The Romans killed Jews and Christians. The Nazis killed Jews and Christians. The communists killed Jews and Christians. And today Islam is killing Jews and Christians. So Allah does not like the Jews. I want to ask you a question. Does the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob love the Jews? And the answer, of course, is yes. God says many times in the Old Testament that the covenant with the Jewish people is an eternal covenant. Now, for the Christians, Romans 9 to 11 are 3 chapters which describe how the Jews had many of their branches chopped off, the root remains, and now new branches are being grafted in to join the tree of Israel. Now, God is doing this to people who are formerly pagans, formerly Gentiles, and in so doing, by grafting these pagans into Israel, turns them into part of the tree of Israel. So Christians are not pagans. Christians are not Gentiles. Christians are now part of the commonwealth of Israel. Now, if God hated the Jews, then God would not graft the Christians into the Jews, because if he hated the Jews, he would not want to do this to the Christians. But God loves the Jews, God loves the Christians, and by the way, I think you will all agree with me that God loves the Hindus and God loves the Buddhists, and I think that God loves his children, the Muslims, as well. Let's look at Allah. Allah hates the Jews. Allah hates the Christians. Allah hates the Hindus. Allah hates the Buddhists. And you know what? I think in my heart of hearts, Allah hates the Muslims as well. So again, we are talking here about polarities. Allah is not God. Allah is Satan. And Islam is a satanic cult. And Islam is not a religion. It is a psychosis caused by this virus known as Satan. So let's look a little bit at what it says in the Quran. In the Quran, chapter 5, verse 51, it says, "Believers, Muslims, take neither the Jews nor the Christians for your friends. The Jews and the Christians are friends with one another. Whoever befriends them will become one of their number. Allah does not guide the wrongdoer." You see, it is a wrongdoing. It is a sin. It is a capital offense for a Muslim to befriend a Jew or a Christian. And if you here in America or in Canada or in Europe know Muslims, and the Muslims swear to you that they are your friends, they are either lying to you or they are lying to Allah. Because in the Quran it says, "Believers, take neither the Jews nor the Christians for your friends. The Jews and the Christians are friends with one another. Whoever befriends them will become one of them. Allah does not guide the wrongdoer." And I have to tell you a little story to show you just how much this is a capital offense for a Muslim to befriend a Jew. There was a story in 1986 in St. Louis about a 16-year-old Palestinian Muslim American high school student. And she was invited out on a date by a black American Christian, and her mother said to her, "You may not go out with a Jewish or a Christian man, because it says in chapter 5, verse 51 of the Quran, you believers take neither the Jews nor the Christians for your friends." And basically, the 16-year-old Palestinian American girl said to her parents living in America, she said, "Come on, Mom and Dad, we're not in the old country now, we are living in America, and I'm going to date whoever I please." So the mother started beating up her daughter, and the daughter picked up the receiver, the telephone, and dialed 911. The mother slapped the receiver out of her hand, but failed to disconnect. So the police tape clicked, and the police sat by, horrified, listening to the dispatcher calling for urgent assistance as the mother held the daughter and the father was stabbing her to death, saying, "In the name of Allah, you must die because you broke the rule of befriending the Jew and the Christian." Now, this is not something I'm making up. This is a story that happened indeed in St. Louis. Let's look at another example of how the Quran views the Jews and the Christians. Chapter 5, verse 60 talks about the Jews and the Christians who betrayed Allah. In other words, the Islamic belief is that Allah at first chose the Jews betrayed him, so Allah wrote them off, and then he chose the Christians. The Christians betrayed Allah, and so Allah wrote off the Christians, and now the chosen people are the Muslims, and the Jews and the Christians are cursed for betraying Allah, and Allah has turned the Jews and Christians into apes and swine. And if you look at chapter 5, verse 60 of the Quran, it says exactly that Allah cursed those who betrayed him, and he turned them into apes and swine. Let me tell you a little story. My wife Rachel monitors the Arabic broadcasts of our neighbors, and she received the following. On a Friday afternoon, during the preachings of the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Mufti is the highest religious authority in Islam, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Sheikh Sabri, gets up and he says in the mosque, in the pulpit, "Kill the Jews, kill the Christians, kill the Israelis, kill the Americans, kill the children of the apes, and kill the children of the swine." This comes from the Quran, chapter 5, verse 60. Now, it's interesting that in August of 2003, my wife and I were traveling in Switzerland, and we gave 7 lectures in 7 cities, and the Muslims came to the meetings. And shortly after that, I was attacked in the Saudi Arabian press, in the biggest newspaper, Al Watan. And by the way, anybody who's interested can email me at my website, vicmord.com, and I will be glad to send you the Saudi article in Arabic as well as in English. Al-Watan is the biggest Saudi newspaper, and I got first page coverage with my picture. So I'm a very popular person in Saudi Arabia. And they were condemning me for giving this teaching about Sheikh Sabri and about, kill the Jew, kill the Christian, kill the Israeli, kill the American, kill the children of the ape, and kill the children of the swine. What I did not know was the date on which Sheikh Sabri gave the speech, and the Saudis, when they attacked me in their article, gave me the date on which Sheikh Sabri made the speech. The Saudis never said that I was lying. They never denied the veracity of my comments. I want to go to another teaching in Islam known as the Hadith. Hadith teaches that on the Day of Judgment, there will be a final battle, and Muslims will annihilate every Jew on the face of the earth. And there will be certain Jews who temporarily evade their deaths. They will hide behind rocks and trees, and on that day, Allah will give mouths to the rocks and trees. And they will call out, "O Muslim pursuers, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him." And again, Rachel comes to the rescue. I have a story from Rachel. Some people might think that I'm radical, that I'm extreme, and I'm making these things up. And I'm not radical, I'm not extreme. I am just giving the mirror image of what the radical extreme Muslims are saying. And I'm here in America most of the time preaching, and my wife is in Israel most of the time by herself. And she goes to fill up with gas. And I have to tell you something. My wife is a very beautiful woman. My wife for 12 years was a TV announcer in Arabic on Israeli TV. And she was really quite a superstar. And we would go into the marketplace to buy cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers, and many of the stall owners were Arabs or Jews who spoke Arabic. And everywhere we went, the men were gawking at my wife as the TV star who was coming to their stall to buy the vegetables. And for example, once my wife went to the health clinic, and there was this old Arab woman there, and she looked at my wife and said, "Aren't you the one on TV?" And my wife said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, my son wants to marry you." And so my wife said, "Yeah, but I'm married already." So the old Arab woman said, "My son doesn't care. He will wait for you to be free, and then he will marry you." So my wife said, "How old is your son?" "He's 25. So my wife said, "Well, I'm 45. This was 10 years ago. So the Arab woman said, "Doesn't matter. The age difference doesn't matter. He's going to marry you." So wherever we went in East Jerusalem, we got red carpet treatment from the Arabs. They love my wife. There's a gas station in French Hill. French Hill is a Jewish neighborhood in northeastern Jerusalem. Next to French Hill is an Arab village known as Isawiya. And a lot of the Arabs who live in Isawiya work in French Hill and in Jerusalem. And the gas station there is basically run by Arabs. It's owned by an Israeli, run by the Arabs from Isawiya. And for many years, we have been filling up gas at this gas station. And there's also a car wash there, also run by Arabs. And they always give my wife the royal treatment. They love her. They really love her, very sweet to her. But one day they said to my wife, "Rachel, we have to be frank and honest with you. You're from Egypt. Arabic is your mother tongue. And you speak just like us. You speak just like an Arab speaks Arabic. And you're a TV star. We love you. You know that. You are min lahmina wa damina. You are from our flesh and blood. You are really an Arab woman. But we have a problem with you, and that is that you are Jewish. And you know that on the Day of Judgment, Allah will give mouths to the rocks and trees, and they will call out, and they will say, 'O Muslim pursuers, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him.'" In other words, Jews hiding behind rocks and trees. And we don't want to kill you, but if you don't become a Muslim, if you don't convert to Islam, we will kill you. And they didn't say it out of anger. They didn't say it out of hatred. They said it out of love. They don't want to kill my wife. But Allah has commanded the Muslims to kill every last Jew on the face of the earth on Judgment Day. So my point is this, again, polarities. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob loves the Jews, loves the Christians, loves the Hindus, loves the Buddhists, and loves the Muslims. Allah, the opposite of God, Satan, hates the Jews, hates the Christians, hates the Hindus, hates the Buddhists, and hates the Muslims. And will use the Muslims to destroy everyone else, and then the Muslims will basically destroy each other and self-destruct, and Satan, unfortunately, will have the victory with the destruction of the planet Earth. And one of the reasons I call for a Christian revival in America and in Canada and in Europe is that without a Christian revival, Satan will win. It is only through a Christian revival that this terrible Satan, Allah, God with a small g, can be destroyed. You know, there are a lot of Jews and a lot of Christians who say, what can we do? Lord is in control. There's nothing that we can do as human beings. But I want to tell you that this is not true. If you go to the book of Exodus, chapter 17, verse 10, there's a battle there in the Bible, a very important battle, in which God has promised the victory to the Israelites. God has promised Moses the victory over Amalek. Amalek is the great enemy from time immemorial and forever of the Jewish people. And the battle was waged in such a way that when Moses would raise his arms into the air, the victory would be of Israel. But the moment Moses tired and lowered his arms, the victory would be of Amalek. And so Aaron and Hur came over, pulled over a boulder, and made Moses sit on the boulder, made him comfortable, and then the two of them, Aaron and Hur, held up Moses' hands until the night, until the sunset, until the end of the battle, so that Joshua could complete the devastation of the forces of Amalek. So God has promised us the victory, but the victory is conditional on us doing what we have to do. And this applies to the Jews, and this applies to the Christians. And I know in Christian theology there is Calvinism and there is Arminius, and I always describe myself as a Calvinist Arminius Jew. In other words, everything is already set according to God's predestination, which is what the Calvinists say. But we do not know what God's predestination is yet, so we have to do everything that we can do. It's kind of like faith without works is dead. We know that faith without works is dead. And we know that these things will happen if we do our job. You do your best, the Lord will do the rest. This is one of my favorite sayings. You do your best, the Lord will do the rest. What I want to do now is go to the fourth deception of Islam. The fourth deception of Islam is that the Muslims come to the Christians and say, you know what, we are really like you guys. We believe in Jesus and we believe in Mary. The problem is it's not the same Jesus, okay? And let me describe for you the Jesus of Islam. Jesus of Islam comes back a second time, according to the Islamic tradition, as a Muslim. And he comes down to earth, he appears on the Golan Heights, then he goes down to where the Ben Gurion airport is, the area of Lod. He fights a battle with the Antichrist, who is a Jew, by the way, according to the Islamic teachings. And he will kill the Antichrist with a spear, kill the Jew with a spear. And then he will go up to Jerusalem, pray on the Temple Mount with 400,000 Muslim believers. And then Jesus, the Muslim, will come down. He will break the crosses. He will destroy the churches of the Christians. He will destroy the synagogues of the Jews. And on that day of judgment, and listen very carefully, all the Jews and Christians who are considered one people in the eyes of Islam, the Jews and the Christians are the Ahl el-Kitab. The Jews and the Christians are the people of the book. All the Jews and the Christians who have not converted to Islam, who have not embraced Allah as the greatest of all the pagan gods, who have not embraced Muhammad as the latest and the greatest of all the prophets, all of these Jews and Christians who have not converted to Islam will have their throats slit by Jesus Christ, the Muslim. And so what I say to Christians in the churches is that this is not the Jesus of Nazareth that we all know and love. The Jesus of Islam is a murderer like Ishmael, a murderer like Esau, a murderer like Muhammad, not the God of love that we all believe in. So this is the fourth deception of Islam. The fifth deception of Islam, I would need an hour just for this. We have about 15 minutes left, and 20 minutes, and I think we'll have a good time anyway. The Quran is, according to the Muslims, the divine, infallible word of Allah to Muhammad. And I have to tell you a little testimony that happened to me in Jerusalem. This is a Jewish testimony, but I will confirm it with a Christian testimony. you know, God sometimes does things to you that you really don't understand. Why is God doing this to me? And then maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, you begin to understand why God is doing this to you. I had an interesting life. I had also some difficulties in life. I had a business for 10 years. I lost my business. I could not get a job. It was very hard to get a job. And finally, I got a position as a real estate agent, which is not really a job. You're a commissioned agent. If you sell, you make money. If you don't sell, you don't make money. And I was not religious at that time. I was just becoming religious. And I got a job as a real estate agent in an Orthodox Jewish establishment, a real estate company. And it was in a Jewish Orthodox neighborhood. And some of the agents were not religious at all. And we were in this office. There were 4 or 5 of us. And one day, I noticed everyone in the office was very nervous. And everybody was gathering up their papers and their briefcases. And they were splitting. They were running out of the office. And the last guy who was leaving the office looked at me and said, "You see that rabbi across the street? He's coming here right now. And he's going to waste your time. He's going to make you show him 15 apartments, and he will never buy an apartment from you. So you better close up shop, lock the store, lock the office, and leave." But I had so many things going on. I said, you know what? How could a person say such terrible things about a Jewish rabbi? And so I stayed there at my desk. I was the only one in the office. And sure enough, this rabbi appears, comes into the office, comes up to my desk, looks at me, and asks me to show him 15 apartments. And by the way, he never bought anything. But you know what? When that rabbi looked me in the eyes, I saw God. I don't know if you ever had an experience like this, that somebody comes up to you. And by the way, it can be a beggar. It can be an absolutely street person. In this case, it was a rabbi. You look in the eyes of that person, and it's almost supernatural. You feel that this is God. And I showed him around 15 apartments, never bought anything, but we became friends. And one day the rabbi honored me and said, "Come to my house, we will have tea. My wife will make you tea." And by the way, in the Middle East, when you are invited to a rabbi's house for tea, this is an extremely important honor. And, but like the other agent said, you know, he's not going to buy anything. And if you're an agent living by commission, if you don't sell, you're not going to make anything. And so it was 5 in the afternoon, and the rabbi says to me, "Come upstairs, let's have tea." And I'm sitting there looking at my watch, and I'm saying it's 4:45, and I'm going to come home for dinner, and my wife is going to say, "Okay, darling, how many apartments have you sold today?" And I will say, "No, I didn't sell anything because I was wasting my time with a rabbi who talked philosophy with me, and I didn't sell anything to this rabbi." So anyway, so we're sitting there and I'm having my tea, and I'm very, very concerned about the fact that I didn't sell any apartments a number of days. I was very depressed. And the rabbi immediately says to me, "Tell me, son, do you know who wrote the Quran?" Out of the clear blue sky. And I said to him, "I don't know, and I don't care." You know, it's like the worst enemy of Jews and Christians is ignorance and apathy. And many times you go into a church and you say the worst enemy of Jews and Christians is ignorance and apathy. And people say, "We don't know and we don't care." So that's basically the kind of throwaway attitude I had with this rabbi. And he said to me, I said, "Muhammad wrote the Quran." I said, "No, Muhammad could not write the Quran because Muhammad was illiterate. Muhammad handed down the Quran in memorized verses, and sometimes these were written on little parchments that other people wrote. And basically, the Quran was written about 80 years after the death of Muhammad. And what happened was this. 80 years after the death of Muhammad, the Muslims had already conquered North Africa, Middle East. 7/11, the Muslims invaded Spain, Portugal, and France. And the Muslims were the best fighters in the world at that time, but they were illiterate nomads. They did not know how to read or write. And so for the Muslims not to have a holy book, see, the Jews had a holy book, the Old Testament. The Christians had a holy book, the New Testament. And so the Muslims, how could they conquer the earth and not have a holy book to replace the book of the Jews and to replace the book of the Christians? And so the rabbi explains to me that since they were nomads and they were Bedouin and they were illiterate, they went to the biblical Talmudic academies in Babylonia, which is now in Iraq, and basically they kidnapped for themselves the best black belt rabbi around. According to the Jewish tradition, his name is Shalom ben Ovadia. And they basically pressed him into the service of Islam. And they said to him, you will write a holy book for us, and after you do so, we will release you. And if you do not write a holy book for us, then we will kill you. Now, why do I say that I have a confirmation from the Christians? And that is because I have met with Christians who are Armenian Christians, Coptic Egyptian, or Syrian Orthodox. And representatives of each of these three Christian communities have said to me that the Quran was written by a priest from their denomination. And so I would like to say in all fairness, I believe that the Quran was written probably by a Jew and a Christian who were both arrested, both detained, both imprisoned, both promised their freedom upon completion of the work, and then both were killed by the Muslims. The Muslims double-crossed the rabbi and the priest and executed them. But the rabbi and the priest, and I hope the truth will come out through me because nobody else is talking about these things, the rabbi and the priest had the last laugh. The rabbi and the priest self-destructed the Quran from within. I don't know how many of you listening or watching this program have heard of Drosnin's Bible Codes or Grant Jeffrey's book, The Signature of God, or Jacob Ramsel's book. But we all know that there are numerological codes in the Hebrew Bible. The rabbi who wrote the Quran inserted the number 19 into the Quran. And you have 19 letters, 19 words, 19 verses, 19 chapters in the Quran. The 19 always repeats itself in the Quran. 19 is a Jewish number. 19 represents a number of things. Firstly, when the Jews pray 3 times a day, we pray in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening, we have a prayer called the Amidah. Amidah in Hebrew means standing up. And when you recite the standing up Amidah, you recite 18 benedictions. The problem is that it's not 18, it's 19 benedictions. The last benediction is a curse on those who are against the people of Israel. And we pray this 3 times a day. And many times in the Quran, you see 3s repeating themselves and 19s repeating themselves. So what the rabbi is doing, the rabbi is taking the Aleph, which is 1, the Bet, which is 2, the Gimel, which is 3, taking the Hebrew alphabet, taking the Arabic alphabet, basically the same thing, and giving it numerological equivalents. And by the way, very important, I'm driving across the United States in 1996, and my book came out in 1995, Is Fanatic Islam a Global Threat? And by the way, the 5th edition of my first book, Is Fanatic Islam a Global Threat? If you go to chapter 19, you find the numerology of 19 in the Quran. How did I come about this? I was in Israel, and the last day I was in Israel before coming to the States, I get an aerogram. In those days, there were aerograms. There was a sheet of paper printed by the U.S. Post Office, and you basically lick one of the sides, and the thing locks up there. And a very dear old Christian woman, rest in peace, writes to me from Phoenix, Arizona, that she heard about me, she's seen my tapes, she's gotten my first book. Well, then it was just a 63-page pamphlet. And she says to me that she would like to buy 200 of my books to hand them out as tracts. So I made a plan to drive to Phoenix, Arizona to visit this woman. Her name was Betty Buckley. And on my drive cross-country, I made it to, trying to remember the place in Missouri, near Kansas City, Lee's Summit. I was going to Lee's Summit to a church there. And a gentleman who had heard about me came from Lexington, Missouri, Charles Sands III. He's mentioned in my book. And he says, we need to talk. You're busy now signing books, visiting with people. Can we have lunch tomorrow? The next day, we had lunch at Luby's there in Kansas City. And he tells me an interesting story. He says that he used to be in the U.S. Air Force, and he served in Tucson, Arizona. And there, in Tucson, Arizona, was a mosque of the Muslims. And there was a Muslim there running the mosque who was found one day dead. He was assassinated in his mosque. in Tucson, Arizona. Now, and he said that there were satanic verses in the Quran. You all know that Salman Rushdie wrote a book called Satanic Verses, and that there was a big furor in this country about the satanic verses. So I was driving anyway to Phoenix to see Betty Buckley, who was buying my books. And when I got to Phoenix, I asked her, did you know about a Muslim preacher who was killed in his mosque in Tucson, which is only a 2-hour drive from Phoenix? And she said to me, no, she didn't know anything about it. I asked the people at a local 7-Eleven. Nobody knew about it. It had never made the news in Phoenix. This was a local story in Tucson, Arizona. So I asked, is there a newspaper in Tucson? They said, yes, the Arizona Daily Star. So I called the Arizona Daily Star, and I asked the lady there in the archives, do you guys have some kind of a story about some Islamic preacher, imam, who was, assassinated in a mosque in Tucson? I said, yeah. We have 28 pages on the guy. His name is Rashad Khalifa, and he was assassinated on the 30th of January, 1990. And I said to her, how do I get these pages? She said, it'll cost you $1 a page. In other words, 28 pages is $28. And you have to come here to Phoenix personally, to Tucson. So immediately I got in my car. I drove to Tucson, paid the $28, and I was in for one of the biggest shocks of my life. This man, Rashad Khalifa, was a Muslim, dear, sincere, humble man, loving man. By the way, my message is never against Muslims. This was truly a godly Muslim religious leader. His story was that he had lived in Egypt as a young man. His father was a Sufi mystic, basically a fanatic Muslim. And as I said before, it says in the Quran not to take the Jew and Christian as a friend. It says in the Quran that the Jews and Christians are pigs and monkeys. But it does not say in the Quran specifically, kill the Jews, kill the Christians. Killing the Jews and killing the Christians is in the Hadith, which is this other teaching that I mentioned. And the Hadith does specifically say to kill the Jews and the Christians, not the Quran. And so he came to his father, who was an Islamic religious leader, and said to him, Daddy, the Quran never says to kill the Jews and the Christians. The Hadith does. So the Hadith is an evil book. The Hadith should be rejected by Muslims. We need to love the Jews and the Christians. And the father almost killed his son on the spot, because the Hadith, which does preach to kill the Jews and the Christians, the Hadith is just as holy, if not more so, than the Quran. And in the Islamic world, if anyone goes against Islam or against the Quran or against the Hadith, it is the responsibility, first and foremost, of the father to kill his son. In other words, this Muslim fanatic Sufi was supposed to kill his son for saying that the Hadith should be rejected and Muslims should follow only the Quran. So Rashad Khalifa escapes from Egypt. He goes to live in Arizona, goes to college, gets a BA, gets an MA, gets a doctoral thesis. He marries a Christian woman. He has a son and a daughter from this Christian woman. By the way, the wife and the daughter and son never converted to Islam, which is a very unusual thing because usually Muslim men force their wives and their children to convert to Islam. And the man was a computer genius. And he started studying the Quran very deeply, and he started to numeralize the Quran. He would take the aleph, or in Arabic, like in Hebrew, make it a 1, or a ba, or a bet, or b, make it number 2. Make the gam, or the gimel, or the c as number 3, and so forth. And lo and behold, over a period of 10 years, Rashad Khalifa computerized the Quran. And he found, like I said before, the numerology of 19. See, the work I do, traveling around the United States, is really like the work of a Maxwell Smart, Agent 86, if you will. I'm like a spy, and I'm stumbling onto things. And it's also really private investigation work. Sometimes I feel like James Garner in the Rockford Files. I have a very, very interesting life. And so here I find the number 19. And I forgot to mention also that 19 has other meanings as well. You see, the Islamic calendar is the lunar calendar. The Christian calendar is the solar calendar. The Jewish calendar is a combination of the lunar solar calendar. And we all know that the sun and the moon coincide every 19 years. So 19 is a very Jewish number. The rabbi was saying 19 times we pray the benedictions, 3 times a day. 19 is the coordination of the sun and the moon. And 19 months was the period of time that Muhammad prostrated to Jerusalem before he changed the direction and people started prostrating to Mecca and turning their backsides to the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem. Anyway, Rashad Khalifa discovers that there are 2 verses in the Quran praising Muhammad over Allah. And lo and behold, these 2 verses do not have the number 19. And so Rashad Khalifa wrote that these 2 verses were not from Allah because they praised Muhammad over Allah. They were from man. And they were inserted later in the Quran. In other words, they changed the Quran. And what happened basically was that a death sentence was issued in Pakistan, and then 2 black Muslim hit teams came from Colorado Springs and Williamsport, Pennsylvania, to Tucson, Arizona, and these 2 black Muslim hit teams assassinated Rashad Khalifa because he said that there were 2 satanic verses in the Quran. Why? Because why were they satanic? But they praised Allah. They praised Muhammad over Allah, and they did not have the number 19. Therefore, they could not have been written in the style of Allah, because the rabbi wrote in the style of 19. So these are things that I have been collecting, and I'm going to share a few things with you now about what is in the Quran and what is not in the Quran. Let's look first what is not in the Quran. What is not in the Quran is what Jesus said are the 2 most important teachings of all. Love the Lord thy God, love thy fellow as thyself. That these are the 2 most important commandments in the whole Bible. They are not in the Quran. That's number 1. Number 2, you've heard of the 10 Commandments. And you look, by the way, at Mark 12, Mark 10. Mark 10 talks about the 10 Commandments, Jesus repeating the 10 Commandments. They are not there in the Quran. There is only one of the 10 Commandments in the Quran. And the Quran says, thou shalt not kill, like commandment number 6. Thou shalt not kill, but it's a little different, thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not kill any man whom Allah has not deemed that you should kill, except for a just cause. So, for a just cause, you can kill. This is a very, very important joke that the rabbi has played on the Muslims, because you can kill for Allah, you can lie for Allah, you can steal for Allah, you can covet thy neighbor's property for Allah, and you can bring in another God before God, which is the violation of commandment number 2. So we have the 10 commandments. They are not in the Quran. Let's look at some of the commandments that are in the Quran. And like I said before, it says in chapter 5, verse 33 of the Quran, that whoever makes war on Allah and his prophet Muhammad, we will kill, we will crucify, we will chop their arms and legs off, and we will banish from the earth. In chapter 2, verse 216 of the Quran, it says, now this is a very, very important verse that has to be exposed. Chapter 2, verse 216 of the Quran says, in English, fighting is obligatory upon you. And even though you may think that fighting is a bad thing and you don't want to fight, Allah knows that fighting is a good thing for you, and therefore you must fight. And if you don't fight, you are a sinner. Now, for American people, we know that fighting is not necessarily a bad thing. Americans like to fight for their democracy. Americans like to fight for their freedom. Americans like to fight for that which is right. So fighting means struggling. By the way, a lot of the politically correct Qurans that are coming out today are saying that it's not really fighting, it's struggling for self-improvement. In other words, this is the lie of Islam. This is the deception of Islam. What really the Quran says in Arabic is the word uqtul. Uqtul in Arabic means slaughtering with the sword. Slaughtering with the sword is obligatory upon you. And even though you may not like to slaughter with the sword, and you might think that slaughtering with the sword is a bad thing for you, Allah knows that slaughtering with the sword is a good thing for you. So it's very important to debunk the Quran. Most people read chapter 2, verse 216, and it goes right over their heads because they don't read it in the Arabic. You need to read the Quran in the Arabic as well. And it's one of the reasons why I've written my 3 books. It's one of the reasons why I'm now producing audios and videos and DVDs and DVDs to get the truth out on the Quran. The Quran is a vicious book of the sword. It is a murderous book. You do not see anywhere in the Judeo-Christian Bible to chop off arms and legs. It does not say anywhere to execute people with the sword. There is execution in the Bible for heinous crimes committed against God. But the only people who are mentioned in the Bible for destruction are the Canaanites because of the temple prostitution, because of the offering up their children on the altar of Molech. Today, the Muslims offer up their children on the altar of Allah when they send their little children with dynamite vests. Or they rape women and then say to the women, well, you've been raped already, and for the honor of the family, you must die. So instead of sending you back to your families to die, put on a dynamite vest and blow up the Jews and the Christians and take them with you. This is the religion of Allah. This is the Quran. The Quran is a sick joke book written by a rabbi and a priest. You have Talmud in the Quran. It says whoever saves a life saves a world. Whoever takes a life destroys the world. They are quoting Sanhedrin, which is the Talmud. Only a rabbi could have put that in. And immediately after he put that in, he said, curse the Jews. And it was the Jews who said it, that whoever saves a life saves the world. Whoever takes a life destroys the world. So you have Talmud in the Quran. You have Midrash in the Quran. Chapter 12, the story of Joseph, is almost verbatim from the Jewish Midrash. You have New Testament in the Quran. You have Old Testament in the Quran. And yet the Quran is like a stew. The Bible is a stew. You have meat, potatoes, onions, carrots, and peas. And the Quran has the same ingredients, but it's like somebody has urinated in it, and you're not going to eat from that stew if you don't want to get poisoned. The Quran is a sick concoction, which is the source of the evil today on the face of the earth. I want to conclude this second session and to link up to the third session. We are going to talk in the third session about terrorism. We're going to talk about 9/11. We are going to talk about the wars of Islamic conquest, the rise and fall of Islam in Spain, Portugal, and France, the rise and fall of Islam through the Turkish invasions of Eastern Europe, and now the third and final rise and fall of Islam through demographic invasion, which is what I call evolutionary Islam, and the revolutionary Islam, which is the violent, militant form of Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, Yasser Arafat, and the others. I believe that this is a war between God and Satan, and Christians know the back of the book, so Christians know who wins. The Christians know who has the victory in the end. But my point is, this is a message not only for Christians, it is for Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, and even for Muslims. I do not want to see the death of the Muslims, but their salvation. And my bottom line is, either you bring the Muslims to the Lord, or the Muslims will bring you to the sword. Either you save the Muslims and bring them to Jesus, or they will come to you with a sword and slit your throats and the throats of the Jews, the Christians, the Hindus, and the Buddhists. This is a war over the survival of the human race and the planet Earth. And I'd like to bless all of you. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his countenance to shine upon you and be gracious. And may the Lord turn his face unto you and grant you peace. Amen.